Blood has always been the currency of power, but in the gilded chambers of kings and queens, not all blood came from the battlefield. Some of it came from the bedsheets of royal brides, proof, demanded and displayed, that the young woman who had just been married was pure. Virginity was not a private matter of love or intimacy. It was a public spectacle, a weapon, a ritual of humiliation carved into the politics of empires. Imagine the throne rooms of Europe, the harems of the Mughals, the palaces of Tudor England, golden chandeliers, silken drapes, and behind them, whispers, fear, and a grotesque expectation. A queen-to-be was not celebrated for her wit, her charm, or her ability to rule. She was reduced to one brutal question. Was her body untouched? And if the answer could not be proven, her crown, her marriage, even her life could collapse in an instant. Royal virginity tests were not medical, not scientific, not even rational. They were rituals of dominance. Monarchs, priests, and courtiers wrapped them in the language of purity and honor. But beneath the surface was something far darker, an obsession with control. By declaring a woman's body verified or stained, entire dynasties rose or crumbled. The future of kingdoms depended on the silent suffering of a girl whose only crime was being born female. And yet, the cruelty did not end at the chamber doors. These tests were designed to humiliate. Some were carried out by midwives under the eyes of watchful courtiers. Others were turned into spectacles, public declarations of whether the bride had passed or failed. The blood of the wedding night became evidence, paraded as if it were a royal decree. A spotless sheet was as valuable as a treaty. A single stain, or its absence, could ignite scandals that shook empires. This was not about morality. It was about power, bloodlines, and politics disguised as purity. Kings who fathered dozens of illegitimate children demanded impossible chastity from their wives. Monarchs who used women as pawns in their alliances also demanded that those pawns arrive untouched, worthy of their thrones. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was always the women who paid the price. Tonight, we unravel a hidden history that polite textbooks rarely mention. A history of whispered inspections, forced examinations, and blood-soaked sheets held up as proof of loyalty. A history where the fate of kingdoms rested not on diplomacy or strategy, but on the most intimate, degrading invasion of a woman's body. Welcome to the dark truth of virginity tests in royal courts, a grotesque blend of politics, misogyny, and control, where power was measured not in crowns or armies, but in the broken silence of women. To understand why virginity tests became a ritual of power, we must strip away the illusion of morality. In the grand chessboard of royal politics, virginity was not a virtue, it was currency. A king did not marry for love. A queen was rarely chosen for beauty alone. Marriages in royal courts were contracts, political mergers between dynasties, sealed with the body of a woman. Her purity was proof that the bloodline was untainted, that the heir born from her womb would belong only to the crown. To guarantee this, rulers demanded evidence, and virginity became a receipt of political legitimacy. Across Europe, treaties were signed not with ink, but with dowries and daughters. The untouched bride was the ultimate offering, a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. When Catherine de' Medici entered the French court, when Anne of Austria crossed into Spain, when countless nameless princesses were handed over to foreign kings, their virginity was as valuable as the armies they brought in alliance. Without it, their worth plummeted. With it, they became the vessel of dynasties. The church played its part, cloaking this obsession in divine language. Popes declared that a virgin bride represented spiritual purity, a holy vessel chosen by God to carry the future king. But behind the sermons was cold strategy. A virgin bride meant a husband could claim absolute certainty of paternity, no bastard blood, no rival claimants, no question of loyalty. Virginity was not a halo, it was insurance for power. Consider Tudor England, where Henry VIII's marital scandals shook Europe. His demand for an untouched, obedient bride was less about morality and more about politics. An unfaithful or impure queen risked producing heirs whose legitimacy could be challenged, threatening the Tudor dynasty itself. In such a world, a queen's chastity was not just her personal virtue, it was the crown's shield against chaos. But the irony was suffocating. monarchs who kept harems of mistresses, who fathered illegitimate children across kingdoms, demanded a level of purity from women that they themselves never upheld. The hypocrisy was stark, yet in the court's eyes, it was natural. A man's infidelity was dismissed as appetite. A woman's supposed impurity was a national crisis. Beyond Europe, this obsession stretched across empires. In Mughal India, concubines and brides were paraded before rulers, their purity certified before they could enter the harem. In Ottoman courts, the Sultan's legitimacy rested on the untouched women delivered to him from across the empire. Purity was not cultural, it was political. From Versailles to Agra, from London to Istanbul, royal virginity was treated as state property. The result was a grotesque contradiction. Women were worshipped as symbols of honor, yet stripped of autonomy. Their bodies were transformed into bargaining chips, inspected and guarded as if they were thrones themselves. Their silence, their compliance was demanded not for love or devotion, but for the survival of empires. Virginity in the hands of monarchs was never about innocence. It was about power, the kind that could topple dynasties if a woman's body was deemed unworthy. And so, the fate of kingdoms rested on the most fragile, most private, and most vulnerable part of a woman's life. This was the stage upon which the invasive tests emerged, a theater of humiliation, where the most intimate proof became the most public weapon. If virginity was currency, then proof of it became ritual, and those rituals, carried out in chambers, courts, and prisons, were anything but dignified. They were crude, invasive, and humiliating performances, designed not to reveal truth, but to remind women of their powerlessness. The so-called tests varied across time and culture, but they all shared one thing. They were more ritualistic torture than medical practice. In medieval Europe, brides were examined by midwives before their wedding night. These women, often chosen by the court, were tasked with confirming what no one could truly prove, that a bride's body was intact. Fingers, eyes, and invasive hands became tools of statecraft, turning a young woman into a specimen to be judged. In some cases, these inspections were shockingly public. In France, rumors spread of entire courts awaiting the results of a royal bride's examination, as if her humiliation were a matter of national entertainment. The presence or absence of blood on the wedding sheets could be paraded before nobles, servants, even ambassadors. A stain became proof of purity. The lack of one could spark whispers of betrayal or annulment. It was less science than spectacle, a grotesque theater of flesh and shame. In Tudor England, this obsession took on a brutal edge. Anne of Cleves, chosen as Henry VIII's fourth wife, was humiliated when the king declared he found her body unappealing and doubted her virginity. The marriage was annulled, not because of proven impurity, but because of suspicion, a suspicion weaponized to shift alliances and secure political advantage. In this world, a queen could be discarded as easily as a pawn in a game of chess. Beyond Europe, the practices were just as invasive. In the Mughal harems of India, new brides and concubines were sometimes subjected to tests conducted by court physicians and attendants, their purity certified before they were allowed to enter the emperor's private chambers. In the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs and midwives served as gatekeepers of the harem, ensuring that women were untouched before they could approach the sultan. The same ritual humiliation repeated itself in palaces across continents. The body of a woman, stripped of dignity, examined as though it were a contract to be notarized. Some methods bordered on cruelty disguised as medicine. Ancient accounts describe the use of physical examinations where officials looked for so-called signs of virginity, tightness, the presence of a hymen, or bodily responses that were nothing more than myth. Others involved public ceremonies in which the bride's sheets were inspected the morning after the wedding, the crimson stain treated like an imperial seal of authenticity. The failure to produce it could spell disaster, annulment, accusations of adultery, or worse. And in prisons, the practice became darker still. Across the centuries, accused women, charged with adultery, witchcraft, or betrayal, were subjected to examinations meant to expose their supposed sins. Inquisitors justified these rituals as seeking truth, but in reality, they were yet another form of degradation. The virginity test became a weapon of humiliation, not only for queens and brides, but for prisoners, slaves, and any woman unfortunate enough to fall under the scrutiny of male authority. The cruelty of these rituals lay in their impossibility. Virginity cannot be measured. The body carries no undeniable sign of innocence or experience. Yet monarchs and courts demanded certainty where none could exist, creating a system where suspicion alone could destroy a woman's life. The tests did not reveal truth, they created it. A bride failed if the court wanted her to fail. A queen passed only if it suited the king's needs. These examinations were less about discovering reality and more about enforcing obedience. They were psychological weapons, reminding every woman who entered the palace that her body was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty, the throne, the empire. From the gilded palaces of Europe to the guarded harems of Asia, from royal weddings to the darkest dungeons, virginity tests spread like a stain across history. They were not science. They were not morality. They were tools, rituals of humiliation wrapped in the language of purity, but born of fear, power, and control. And for the women subjected to them, the cost was unbearable, because behind every test was a question that carried life or death consequences. What happens if she fails? For the women who lived under these traditions, virginity tests were not abstract politics. They were lived nightmares, endured in silence with everything at stake. To be chosen as a royal bride was often portrayed as the pinnacle of fortune, but beneath the jewels and silks lay terror. For every young queen, every concubine, every child bride, the moment of proof was a knife against her throat. Consider the story of Catherine of Aragon, sent from Spain to marry England's Prince Arthur. Barely a teenager, she was scrutinized not as a daughter or bride, but as a political investment. After Arthur's sudden death, her virginity became the central question of her fate. Was she still untouched? If yes, she could marry his brother, Henry VIII. If not, her political value vanished. Catherine was forced to swear under oath that she had never consummated her first marriage. Her entire future, her crown, her survival, rested on the most intimate and humiliating interrogation of her body. She was not alone. Royal brides across Europe and Asia lived under the same knife of suspicion. In France, Margaret of Valois, sister to King Henry III, was publicly humiliated when rumors spread that her marriage bed had not produced the evidence of her purity. The court erupted with gossip, her reputation scarred forever. In such cases, the burden always fell on the woman, while the man's role was never questioned. In Mughal India, young women entering the emperor's harem were tested in ways that stripped them of dignity before they had even spoken to their new husband. Their value was measured not by their education, their wit, or their potential as consorts, but by a forced certification of purity. Some were little more than children, handed over as pawns in alliances, and forced to endure examinations they barely understood. The consequences of failure were devastating. A queen declared impure could face annulment, disgrace, or banishment. In some cases, whispers of lost virginity led to accusations of adultery, crimes that could result in execution. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's ill-fated queen, may not have been tested in the traditional sense, but the same obsession with her chastity fueled charges of infidelity that sent her to the scaffold. The test, whether literal or symbolic, always loomed. For others, the torment was psychological. Imagine being a 12-year-old girl, ripped from your home, dressed in royal silks, and presented before a court that sees you not as human, but as property. Imagine lying awake on your wedding night, not fearing your new husband, but the stain that must appear on the sheets, knowing that your crown and your life depends on it. The pressure was unbearable, and the silence surrounding these ordeals left many women broken long before their reigns began. What makes these stories even darker is how normalized they became. To the courts, these were not cruelties. They were traditions, upheld for the stability of kingdoms. But to the women forced to endure them, they were nothing less than violations dressed as ceremony. Royal brides were paraded as symbols of alliance, purity, and power. But behind the curtains, they were fragile girls crushed under the weight of dynasties. Their bodies were never their own, their voices never heard. They lived and died beneath the blade of tradition, where failure meant ruin, and success meant nothing more than survival. Virginity tests were never private humiliations. They were political weapons, capable of shaking entire kingdoms. When a queen's purity was questioned, it was not just her reputation at stake, it was the legitimacy of bloodlines, the survival of dynasties, and the fragile peace between empires. The morning after a royal wedding could become a spectacle of shame. Courtiers gathered to see whether the sheets bore the crimson evidence of consummation. If they did, the alliance was secure. If not, rumors spread like wildfire. A single stain of absence could be twisted into scandal, whispered into every corridor, until it reached the ears of kings and enemies alike. In courts obsessed with image, the silence of the bedsheets could roar louder than any army. One infamous case unfolded in 16th century France. King Henry IV's marriage to Margaret of Valois was marred by gossip when no proof of her virginity was displayed. Enemies seized the chance to undermine the union, accusing her of dishonor. Though Margaret denied it fiercely, the damage was done. Her body had become a battlefield for political factions, her worth shredded by suspicion. Elsewhere, virginity tests became weapons of annulment. Henry VIII famously used the question of Catherine of Aragon's purity to dissolve their marriage, claiming she had lied about her union with his brother. By casting doubt on her chastity, he not only rid himself of an unwanted wife, but also justified reshaping the English church. A queen's failed purity was not just personal tragedy, it was the spark for a religious revolution. The hypocrisy behind these scandals was staggering. Kings who paraded mistresses openly, who fathered illegitimate children across the realm, still demanded absolute chastity from their brides. A man's infidelity was indulgence, a woman's was treason. The double standard was as cruel as it was deliberate, ensuring that women alone bore the crushing burden of purity. And sometimes, the fallout reached far beyond the palace walls. Questions of legitimacy could ignite wars of succession, plunging nations into chaos. A queen's supposed impurity could delegitimize her children, turning princes into bastards overnight and giving rival claimants reason to march armies. The control of female sexuality was not about morality. It was about power, inheritance, and survival. In this world, shame was not private, but public policy. A failed test, a whisper of dishonor, could ruin marriages, topple alliances, and even end lives. Women became pawns in a ruthless game, their worth reduced to fragile symbols of purity. And in the blood-soaked politics of monarchy, those symbols carried the weight of entire empires. The crowns have crumbled, the empires have fallen, but the shadow of these rituals still lingers. The obsession with controlling women's bodies did not die with the monarchs who demanded proof on blood-stained sheets. It echoes chillingly into the modern world. In some countries today, so-called virginity exams are still performed, forced upon women in prisons, schools, and even marriage negotiations. Doctors and officials press their fingers into myths that science has long disproven, searching for signs that do not exist. Just as in the palaces of Europe or the harems of Asia, the practice has nothing to do with truth and everything to do with power. The United Nations has condemned these tests as violations of human rights, acts of psychological and physical violence. Yet they persist, fueled by the same toxic mixture of tradition, patriarchy, and fear that once ruled the royal courts. A young girl in the 21st century can still be humiliated by the same ritual that haunted queens 500 years ago. What makes this legacy so haunting is its continuity. History tells us that kingdoms rose and fell, alliances were forged and broken, dynasties built and destroyed, all on the fragile lie that virginity could be proven. And yet, centuries later, women in many societies still face the same dehumanizing demand. It is as if the world never truly left the throne rooms of the past. The stories of royal brides remind us that this was never about morality or holiness. It was about control. It was about silencing women, reducing them to vessels of honor and symbols of power. And while the gilded crowns may be gone, the chains of those traditions remain. The history of virginity tests is not just a story of monarchs and queens. It is a mirror reflecting the darkest truth of human societies, that the control of women's bodies has always been the cornerstone of power. And until these rituals are buried with the empires that created them, the echo of blood, shame, and silence will continue to haunt our present.